The fun story begins with an old lady telling a story to her granddaughter. The granddaughter was very interested in these stories, so the old lady narrated a very interesting tale set in a city from a long time ago. In this city, there was a saleswoman named Linda who used to sell products from various companies by going door to door. She had completed her work across the entire city and was very happy with her job. While roaming the city, Linda noticed a very large and old castle situated on top of a mountain. Linda felt a strong urge to check out the castle, so she took her car and went there. She noticed that the place was very old, and there was no one around the castle. However, as soon as Linda entered the garden, she saw that the trees and plants were beautifully trimmed into various animal shapes, making them look quite impressive. Due to all this, Linda thought that there must be someone living there, so she decided to go inside the castle to explore. Although she didn't see anyone inside, she noticed large equipment that seemed to have been used for experiments in ancient times. These things appeared to be from a bygone era, suggesting that experiments had been conducted there, but now everything seemed to be shut down. Linda, traveling up to the first floor, hoped to find someone, but still, she saw no one. Suddenly, she noticed a shadow of someone sitting in a shelter. Terrified, Linda shouted that whoever was there should come out, or she would call the police. Slowly, a very unfamiliar man emerged, wielding dangerous weapons. Linda was frightened by this and tried to escape, but the man pleaded with her not to run away, saying that everyone always leaves him alone and he is left by himself. Hearing these things, Linda stopped and looked at him carefully. She then realized that the weapons on the man's hands were actually connected to his body parts and included scissors. This meant that the man didn't want to harm her but rather didn't want to be alone. When asked, the man introduced himself as Edward. Linda also noticed that Edward's face had many scars, which he must have inflicted on himself. This made Linda quite sad, so she started touching Edward's wounds. It turned out that Edward wasn't a human but a robot that hadn't been fully completed. These events were from many years ago, and Edward had been living in the castle since then. Linda didn't like this at all and wanted Edward to experience the world outside the castle. So, she told Edward to come with her and stay at her home. Edward agreed because he didn't want to be alone. Linda took Edward in her car to her home. When Edward came out of the palace after so many years, he observed everything around him with great interest because he had never seen the world before. He had spent most of his time inside the castle. Linda brought Edward to her home, where he was fascinated and closely observed everything. Linda also provided Edward with clothes to wear, but since Edward still had scissors attached to his hands, he couldn't wear the clothes properly, and some parts even got cut. Linda noticed this and helped him with the clothes. Soon, it was time for dinner. Linda's husband and her 2 children were there, having dinner. They were surprised to see Edward and wondered how Linda had brought him there. Edward had difficulty eating properly due to the scissors on his hands, which Linda noticed. However, there wasn't a moment when Linda scolded Edward or asked him to behave properly. She treated him like part of her family and spoke to him very kindly. After eating, Edward went outside to the garden. Linda's husband was shaping and taking care of the trees and plants. When Edward saw this, he went over to the trees and started using the scissors on his hands to trim them. In no time, Edward shaped the entire bush into the form of a dinosaur. Linda's husband was completely amazed by this because it was a skill that a normal person couldn't have. Linda's father encouraged Edward for his impressive skills. Edward was pleased and continued shaping more trees, even creating figures of Linda and her family. Linda's entire family was very impressed with him. But as they say, not everyone is happy with a family's joy. When some of Linda's neighbors learned that there was a new member in her family and they were very happy, many neighbors started peeking into Linda's house. Several neighbors came over and asked to meet the new, talented person in Linda's family. They all told Linda that they wanted to meet him during dinner and that dinner would be at Linda's house. Linda wasn't thrilled about this, but since they had invited themselves, she began preparing a dinner party for them. Edward helped Linda by cutting vegetables with his hands. He did it very well, which impressed Linda. However, while Linda was opening a can, Edward started to recall something. It was a flashback scene from when he lived in the palace. Edward kept remembering that moment from his time in the palace. It was many years ago, and there was an old scientist who conducted experiments. All the equipment there had been created by this scientist, and they were quite advanced for that time. We are shown that all the robots owned by the scientist were performing automatic tasks, each with its own specific function, and they carried out these tasks without any thought. The scientist even had these robots handle all his meals. One day, the scientist approaches a robot with scissors for hands, who was cutting vegetables. This robot was none other than Edward. The scientist had conducted additional experiments on Edward, aiming to enhance him to the point where the robot would not exhibit human-like emotions. The scientist had made many changes to the robot and, eventually, Edward gained a more human-like appearance, making him very happy as his importance increased. The scientist's sole goal was to transform this robot into a being so human-like that no one could tell the difference between a human and a robot. After completing everything, the scientist noticed that the robot's hands had not changed, the scissors were still present. The scientist had even ordered replacement hands for the robot, hoping that Edward could become fully human. However, the reason why this never happened will be revealed shortly. Now, we return to the present time, where many of Linda's neighbors have come to her house to meet Edward, as he is quite interesting. Although everyone was surprised by the scissors on his hands, they still found Edward fascinating and wanted to learn more about him. Edward was pleased that so many people were recognizing and valuing him, something he had never experienced before. He hosted them well and served them delicious food. Edward was in his room when Linda's daughter, Kim, arrived. Kim had been on a tour with her friends and was returning after a week without informing anyone. Kim had no idea about Edward, and Edward, upon seeing Kim, was startled. He was simply lying on his bed. Kim entered the room and started undressing. They hadn't seen each other yet, but as Kim looked at her reflection in the mirror, she noticed Edward lying on the bed. Kim screamed loudly and ran out of the room, causing her family to rush in shortly after. Edward, feeling quite embarrassed, quickly left the room. Linda explained to Kim that Edward was a new member of the family and that they would have to share the room. Kim was not pleased with the idea of an unfamiliar person being part of her family, but she had to accept it as her mother insisted. The next day, Edward used his skills to transform all the surrounding trees into intricate structures. This impressed all the neighbors, and Edward felt happy to be accepted and appreciated. He continued using his skills to provide creative and beautiful shapes to the trees and plants. Kim, however, felt extremely jealous of Edward because her family now paid more attention to him than to her. While Edward was busy shaping the trees, he noticed a dog with overgrown fur. Using his scissor hands, he started trimming the dog's fur. Within a short time, he made the dog look very well groomed, which delighted its owner. The news quickly spread, and soon all the neighbors brought their dogs to Edward for grooming. Edward became so skilled that he could transform the dog's fur into impressive styles in no time. A line of dog owners formed, all eager to have their pets groomed by Edward. One owner, thrilled with how her dog looked, asked Edward to also cut her hair. Edward, focused on his skills, began trimming the lady's hair. Within a short while, her hair, which was messy, was transformed into a well-styled look. The lady was very pleased with her new hairstyle, which was created in a beautiful structure. As a result, all the neighbors moved their dogs aside and began approaching Edward to get their own haircuts. Edward continued to style everyone's hair in various new and unique styles. Even Linda got her hair cut by Edward. The neighbors were so impressed that they didn't even pay Edward, they were getting their hair styled for free. Consequently, Edward gained a lot of fame and became well known throughout the city as someone who could create numerous styles using his hands. His recognition grew so much that he began receiving invitations to appear on TV shows. In a short span, he became a social media star. During an interview, a lady suggested that if Edward had such great skills, he should open his own salon. Edward was completely unaware of what a salon was, but Linda found the idea appealing. She decided to take Edward to a bank to apply for a loan to open the salon. However, the bank manager informed them that they couldn't grant a loan to Edward because he had no income source and no proof of ability to repay the money. Thus, Edward couldn't get the loan. But Edward wasn't disappointed as he had no understanding of money and didn't care about it. He only desired one thing, Linda's daughter, Kim. Edward had fallen in love with Kim, and Kim also liked Edward to some extent. They began a relationship that they wanted to develop further. However, Kim's friend disapproved of her relationship with Edward and wanted to put a stop to it. Kim's friend devised a plan to frame Edward. He approached Kim and suggested that they all go on a trip together. However, there was only one problem. The key to the car was locked in a room, and only Edward could unlock it with his sharp hands. Kim needed to spend time with Edward, so she immediately asked him for the key. Edward agreed to help her and went along. With the help of a van, Kim, her friend, and several others entered Edward's house. The door to the room where the key was kept was locked, and Edward began working to unlock it. He quickly opened the door and entered the room, but suddenly, security alarms started ringing, and the door locked itself. Edward was now trapped inside the room. Kim and her friends realized that the police could arrive any moment due to the alarm, so they hurriedly fled. Kim did not want to leave Edward like this, but her friend forcibly took her away in the van, fearing that the police might catch them. Kim's friend drove off, leaving Edward behind. Edward was confused and had no idea where to go. Kim and her friends had escaped in the van, and soon after, the police arrived. Seeing Edward, the police arrested him. Edward, however, did not mention Kim and her friends because he did not want them to get involved. Edward was then taken to court, where a case was filed against him. Eventually, it was decided that Edward had spent his entire life in a palace and had rarely interacted with people. Therefore, he must have felt very lonely and confused, which led him to wander into the house. Given these circumstances, Edward could not be punished, so he was released. Linda managed to bring Edward back home, where many media personnel had gathered to interview him for their news channels. When Edward was approached by the media team, he felt extremely embarrassed. And she thanked Edward, saying she was grateful that he didn't mention her name. However, Kim soon realizes that the entire plan was her friend's doing. He had intended to trap Edward there. But it turns out Edward had already known about the plan. Kim, shocked, says, "If you had known earlier, you could have told me." Edward simply replies that since Kim had asked him to help, he couldn't refuse her. Kim feels guilty and her respect for Edward grows significantly. She embraces Edward warmly, and their relationship becomes much stronger. Soon, Christmas arrives, and Edward is busy sculpting a large statue in the garden area to cheer Kim up. He decorates the huge snow structure beautifully, just for her. Kim hears the commotion and immediately heads to the garden area, enjoying the falling snow and the statue. Edward, focused on his work, is unaware that Kim has arrived. Soon, Kim's friend shows up and shouts at Edward, saying that the noise is too loud. Edward gets distracted, and his hand inadvertently moves toward where Kim is standing, resulting in the scissors on his hand injuring Kim. Kim starts bleeding from her hands and screams in pain. Linda rushes to her daughter, taking Kim inside the house to provide first aid. Kim tells her mother that Edward did not do this intentionally. He didn't see her standing behind him, and it was an accident. Despite Kim's explanation, her friend becomes very angry with Edward, declaring that he is dangerous and doesn't deserve to be among people. Edward tries to defend himself, saying that he has done many good things for everyone, but Kim's friend continues to berate him and tells him to leave. Kim, feeling deeply saddened, leaves the scene, believing that everyone was just using her and Edward. Kim becomes so enraged that she tears her clothes and starts destroying the tree structures she had made. The neighbors, who once liked Edward, changed their opinions after the police complaint against him. One lady even filed a police complaint against Edward due to his actions, as he was destroying the structures. When Kim goes outside, she can't find Edward anywhere and becomes very distressed. She asks her friend about Edward and learns that her friend had chased Edward away by saying bad things about him. Kim becomes extremely angry with her friend and decides to end their friendship. Now, Kim's family members set out to find Edward. Meanwhile, Edward is shown sitting alone and looking very sad. After a while, a dog with long hair approaches him. Edward uses his scissors to trim the dog's hair, which makes him feel a bit better. Edward decides to forget the past and return to Kim, as she is the only one who brings him joy. Edward goes back home, where Kim is present because her parents went out to search for her. When Kim sees Edward, she is very happy because she realizes that Edward was not at fault, it was her friend who had set him up to separate them. Kim becomes very emotional and asks Edward to hug her. However, as Edward moves forward, he notices the scissors in his hands and pulls his hands back, not wanting to hurt Kim. Eventually, Kim approaches Edward and hugs him herself. They both confess their love for each other. At this moment, Edward recalls the scene when the scientist was creating him. The scientist had planned to replace Edward's scissor hands with normal hands, but before he could do so, he suffered a heart attack. Due to the scientist's sudden death, Edward's experiment was never successful. Edward even tries to lift the scientist, but only marks are left on his body. This causes Edward a lot of pain because, if the hands had been replaced, he would have fully transformed into a human. Now we see Kim's friend, who is drinking with his companions. Kim's friend is very displeased that Kim is leaving with a person he considers useless like Edward. Angry, he speeds up the van with his friends. Edward realizes what's happening and notices Kim's brother on the road, whose life is in danger. Edward rushes out of the house to save him. Just as the van is about to hit Kim's brother, Edward jumps in and pushes him away, saving him. Kim's brother is a bit frightened, so Edward tries to comfort him. However, with scissors as hands, Edward unintentionally leaves several marks on Kim's brother's face. This causes Kim's brother to scream, and soon, his family and the people around gather. When Kim's father arrives, Edward accidentally injures him as well. Everyone starts to believe that Edward has gone mad and is causing harm. Kim's friend seizes the opportunity and starts attacking Edward. Edward, extremely angry, retaliates and injures Kim's friend before fleeing. Many police vans arrive at the scene because they believe Edward is responsible for the chaos, and they start chasing him. Edward, in a state of panic, runs back to the place where he used to live, the old palace. This is the same palace where the scientist created several robots, including Edward himself. Edward realizes that he cannot live among humans and that his place is in the palace, where he will stay forever. Kim, who witnessed the entire scenario, knows that Edward did not do all this intentionally. She trusts that Edward must have gone to the palace, so she goes there to find him, believing he is there. When Kim arrives and calls out, Edward is sitting calmly. Kim tries to comfort him, assuring him that it was not his fault. However, the worst part is that Kim's friend, who followed her with a gun, starts firing at Edward, trying to kill him. Edward's first priority is to protect Kim from the bullets. Kim's friend severely beats Edward and injures him, which makes Kim furious. She confronts her friend, but he soon grabs Kim and starts hitting her. Edward cannot tolerate this and, in a fit of rage, confronts Kim's friend, using his sharp scissors to stab him. Kim's friend falls out of the window and dies a painful death. Seeing Edward unharmed, Kim is overjoyed and expresses her love, saying she wants to spend her life with him. However, if people find out that Edward killed her friend, he will end up in jail. So, when the city's residents arrive to see the dead body, Kim quickly comes down and shows the scissors-covered hands, explaining that her friend and Edward fought each other and both died in the process. This convinces everyone that no one is to blame, and both had fought to their deaths. Kim managed to save Edward's life in some way, as any encounter with the police could have put him in danger. The scene then shifts to a place where a lady is telling a story to her granddaughter. We realize that the lady is none other than Kim herself, as many years have passed since the events of the story. Kim tells her granddaughter that she still believes Edward is alive and remains in the palace because robots don't age, they live on as long as their systems work. Her granddaughter asks why, if they loved each other so much, Kim never tried to meet Edward. Kim explains that a relationship between a human and a robot is impossible, so she had to make a decision and part ways with Edward. However, she still loves him deeply and didn't want Edward to see her in her old age. She wanted him to remember her as she was when they first met. After telling the story, Kim becomes emotional and starts crying because she still loves Edward very much. The scene then shifts back to the palace where Edward is still alive, creating many works of art using his hands. It's Christmas Day, and Edward is making structures out of ice inside the house, just like he did years ago for Kim. As the small pieces of ice fall outside, it reminds Kim of the Christmases when Edward prepared presents for her. Whenever Kim sees the falling snow in the city, she understands that Edward is still doing it for her. And with this happy ending, our story comes to a close.